I can go now.
It's all good.
I'm
going to welcome my colleagues to the stage. I'm particularly going to welcome Gigi, who's just made it. Thank you. So thank you for that. And our topic today is a degree worth it in a future workforce? So when we had a preparatory session, we decided the answer was yes, and we could all just have an early lunch. Thank you very much. Oh, but wait. I'd like to give you some opening and framing remarks before we have what we hope is a very interactive panel session with you, either through the event poll or by having questions and comments from the floor. So, 3 things from me. I'd like to give you a snapshot of the immediate past. We were asked to talk by TEXA, our marching orders are to cover employability, online education, micro-credentialing and the future workforce, and world peace. Oh no, sorry. World peace is after lunch, sorry. It's a pretty broad brush. So within those ideas, some thoughts from me. In the 2017 data that we all collect, in 2017 there were about 182,000 external enrolments in this country. I'm going to tell you about the invisible online learner. There are about 182,000 externals. We can assume many of those, if not most, are now learning online in this country. They're not kids, and they're not coming to campus, and they're not studying all disciplines. They live in every town and city in this country, and if I put up a map of Australia, you would see blue dots everywhere. In this country, 2% of them are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, 67%, 2/3 are female. 3% of them are under 20 years of age. We can assume they are the undergraduate students, I think, and 7% of them are over 50 years of age, and they are studying, I know, both undergraduate and postgraduate degrees. 13% of these external learners were born outside Australia. So they're all ages and they live in every state and territory, and if you have online students, they don't necessarily live in your state or territory, as I do remind my Deakin colleagues. Please stop saying, have a great weekend on Twitter and posting pictures of the Melbourne laneways, because our student in Broome isn't experiencing that. You can't spot these students in the wild. I put to you, they may be sitting within metres of you right now. But they do live in all the regions and the cities. And to find them, you'd have to look for a lamplight, probably after 9 o'clock at a kitchen table or in a study, because that's when they're doing their work. So there are some issues with that. So that's one picture for you. I'm going to take you now to a different picture, which is the immediate past. So switch your thinking slightly. As recently as January 2016, I wrote a report as part of an OLT grant. You may know about it. It's called Better 21st Century Credentials, and it was about digital badges, now known often as micro-credentials. The report is out of date. It's 2.5 years old, and I'm about to publish an upgraded version. In that report I wrote, I concluded that based on publicly available information to date, the MOOCs, which is what we were talking about, the MOOC does not as yet provide a better 21st century credential. I also wrote, to hedge my bets, it's way too early to dismiss them, because in a time when higher education credentials are highly sought after, very expensive, it's difficult to see how these new credentials, done well, will not eventually have a disruptive influence. So less than 3 years later, I can tell you that as of October 2018, on the 3 large global platforms with which I'm sure you're familiar, edX, Coursera and FutureLearn, 41 postgraduate degrees, not counting micromasters, but actual degrees, 41 postgraduate degrees are offered on those global platforms, and they are often prefaced by what we would have called a few years ago a MOOC, or a free open course. 36 of them are master's degrees. They range in price in Australian dollars from $14,000 to $42,000. So if you are a young woman about to launch into an online MBA, because 2/3 of you would be women, you could in fact do Deakin's online MBA. Sorry, that's a plug. I'm not telling you the price, you can look it up. Or you can go and do Macquarie's now, which is cheaper, at $33,000, and it's on Coursera. Or also on Coursera, you can do Illinois' MBA for $31,000, or on FutureLearn, you can do Coventry's MBA at $29,000. So the gamble that some of us are taking, because 6 Australian universities are already doing this, Deakin, Curtin, UQ, Macquarie, Murdoch, Newcastle, and I'm sorry if I don't know the others or I've missed them. The gamble we're taking is, can we draw students from a wider geography than we already do in this continent? Can we in fact enrol students offshore? I know Richard Garrett is going to have a lot of interesting things to say about this after lunch. So now I'm going to go to some propositions, and then I'm going to meet with my panel and we're going to have interaction. So I put some propositions to you. First of all, I'd like to say, when we talk about worthless and useless degrees, it is a thing, just Google it. I'd like to say there is no such thing as a worthless education. A degree, an education, is always worth it, whatever that means, because we know that we're creating a more educating society and more informed voters. I'll just leave that with you. But a degree often, or pretty much always, brings debt. A couple of comments about cost. Degrees cost time and money, and they cost opportunities. They have benefits. The experience itself may be the benefit. Career or life outcomes may be the benefit. But when you do Google useless degrees, you will see people talking about whether this helped me start my career, switch my career, or advance my career. Are degrees as signals outdated? Are they too long? Should we have shorter ones? Could we do recognition for prior learning much better, so whatever degree you do, you start from the right place for you? What is employability in a future world of work, where work in fact might be more scarce? What will meaningful paid work be? In a digital economy, will some learners opt for digital education? We've already heard the students this morning, and I can tell you at my university where 75% of students do opt for some kind of on-campus education, many of them behave like the fully online learner anyway, and I think Mark Pace showed us that this morning as well. So they are some opening thoughts. I'd like you to welcome Natasha, Gigi and Grant. I won't introduce them in detail. We are going to try and make this like a little bit of a dinner party conversation with, sorry folks, without the wine. We're going to try and speak briefly and just interact. We're going to try and interact with you on the screen, and it's going to be pretty unscripted. So let's have a conversation. And I'm going to ask my panellists, without being stereotypical, which of you is an enrolled student currently? Because as I just said, you can't tell by looking at people. I thought so. So Natasha, you're on first. Give us some opening thoughts, and then the rest of us are going to jump in.
Thank you. Thanks. Hi again, everyone. I'm Natasha. I'm the president of the Council of Australian Postgraduate Associations. So I'm just going to quickly pick up on a couple of thoughts on the topic of, is a degree worth it in a future workforce? So the first point, which I'm sure many of us are aware of, is that a degree is not what it used to be. So many years ago, if you got a degree, that was a huge benefit to you when you're entering the workforce. However, now we're seeing as more and more people get degrees, this is becoming less of a bonus and more of a minimum requirement. And I found among my peers, when we graduated our undergraduate degrees, some of them felt a bit aggrieved because their parents were telling them, go to university, get a good job. They went to university, but they didn't get the good job. And I guess they thought things hadn't changed since their parents' generation. So yes, so there's a degree has kind of moved from something that's being really good, makes you really well regarded, to something that literally everyone has. And then from that postgraduate perspective, that inflation has caused, I suppose, postgraduate degrees to become the new undergraduate degrees, because now postgraduate degrees confer a huge earning benefit when you do enter the workforce. A second point which I wanted to pick up is employer demands. So we often hear a bit of doom and gloom. University graduates aren't prepared for the workforce. They lack soft skills. They're not industry ready, whatever that means. It wasn't that long ago that in the news it was reported that universities aren't producing good enough journalism graduates for newspapers to even hire anyone, yet at the same time we know that there is a surplus of journalism graduates for the number of positions that there are. And I did want to highlight on that maybe there is a role for employers in making sure that the people that they hire are worth it, and training them rather than relying on universities to do all of that training and getting them ready for whatever job they're going to get. And finally, I just wanted to touch on that a degree is not just about entering the workforce. So building on those earlier comments, it's not just about employment, especially for undergraduate degrees, especially for students studying under the Melbourne model where they do a generalist degree. It's not just about what job you're going to get at the end. Students often do want to study in order to broaden their horizons, learn more about the world, learn more about themselves, and ultimately become more informed citizens. So I will leave it there and throw over to our next panellist.
Thank you very much, Natasha. And what we can do is I think my microphone's on. Am I on? Yeah, thank you. So we can go to the podium, or we can sit and chat like this is dinner. But I'm going to go to you next, Grant, because I'm going to ask you to give us an elevator pitch. You're from New Zealand, you're from the New Zealand Quality Assurance Agency, and I know because I talked to you yesterday. And New Zealand is recognising these newfangled micro-credentials in the qualifications framework. So can you give us the elevator pitch? What's that about?
We see micro-credentials as a variation in education product that could be interpreted in two ways. Either over time they may prove to be ways of recognising and legitimating smaller packages of learning, which will typically be taken by individuals as they progress throughout their working life. So that's a very conservative interpretation of the impact of micro-credentials. A more radical vision is that micro-credentials may prove to be a very disruptive force inside the education and training system, on the basis that they help liberate us from thinking about the relationship between the level of a program and typical credit value. So for example, if you have 30 credits of training at level 9 of the qualifications framework, and that is registered. So in the case of New Zealand, we have micro-credentials listed on our website, which show which micro-credentials have been approved, and the learner gets to have those micro-credentials recognised inside their NZQA held learner of record achievement. So we're raising the profile of these non-qualification credentials, and it may be that over time, for some of the reasons that we've heard today, individuals may see the value of doing a range of micro-credentials and presenting those alongside a much more rich and diverse set of life experiences. And employers may look for that diversity of experience rather than a single face-to-face, long-term, on-campus degree.
Thanks, Grant. And in our preparatory conversation, I got the idea that Gigi may not be a believer, which is great. So let's have some debate. Gigi, what do you think?
Well, I'm an economist, so I guess that makes me not a believer in some things. But as an economist, I guess I see this very much as a question of the results of market forces. So micro-credentials may eventually be valued by employers. It's possible. What we have now is a system where employers use standard bricks and mortar degrees as signals of something good. right? It's a signaling game that is played, even if nothing got learned in universities at all. And there are economic papers that have shown this, right? Even if there's nothing that's learned, the very fact that you have to be selected into those university programs by getting a good ATAR or writing a good essay or whatever means that the employer then, after you get out, can say, well, I know that because you got into that institution, you must be a good worker or have some potential or something, so I will take you. Now, how do you build such a reputation? Well, education is a credence good. We go to an educational institution believing, credence, that they're going to teach us something, right? That we're going to get something valuable out of it. And only really with hindsight can we tell whether that was useful. And so we have had scandals like the vet scandal because people are able to be preyed upon by this dynamic. So with micro-credentialing, essentially it takes time to build up a reputation of being worthwhile. So whether an employer thinks a micro-credential is a good idea, it does not have to do nearly as much with whether the New Zealand version of TEXA puts a stamp on it that says, yes, good. It's much more whether the employer has had experiences with other students who have gone through this micro-credential. Maybe they know somebody who teaches in it, or they've seen the curriculum and they know themselves the content and they can make a judgment. It's all very at the coalface, making estimations about whether this is valuable. And to the extent that universities and other higher education providers that are more traditional are vulnerable to micro-credentials overtaking them, it is because they are not looking after their own quality properly. Eventually, if a micro-credential is proven in the marketplace by employers selecting people with those credentials to be delivering a higher quality education than a university, that says the university has not been keeping its own house in order, or the higher education provider has not been keeping its own house in order. So it is about trying to understand what kind of quality is actually going on at universities, what's being delivered at universities, and that is a very slippery beast, as TEXA knows. To try to make a judgment on that, again, as an economist, I go back to the market. Are employers still valuing graduates of universities A, B, C, D, E? Do an employer survey. Employer surveys are great. Where would you most like to have somebody get a degree from, or what kind of CV do you most like? One that says, Deakin University, one that says micro-credential A, B, C, D, E, and lots of life experience.
Okay, good. Thank you. I've read 2 really interesting books on this lately, and I'd like to share them with you, and I'm sure many of you have too. The Future of University Credentials by Sean Gallagher is a really good read. And another one is The Case Against Education by Brian Kaplan. And you may have read that one too. He talks about credentials as signals, and he's not so sure that employers are actually reading those signals the way we are. In fact, he says sometimes we read the signal as, I'll go back to something you just said, Gigi, that sometimes we classify people as, that person got into Harvard or Stanford but dropped out. Didn't matter. The fact that they got in was a signal. He also says the fact that we complete a degree is a signal that we can really put up with a great deal of boredom and we're really resilient. And that we can...
you need in the workplace.
Yeah, that's true. That's a good skill. And that may be that it's credential creep. So before I go to these questions which are coming in now, thank you very much. Do you think we've got credential creep, Natasha? Do you think people feel, and we've heard it already, is there a large feeling that bachelor just doesn't cut it anymore? Masters?
Absolutely, yeah. So we've seen skyrocketing enrolments, both among domestic and international students in postgraduate studies over the last decade. Just the increase since the Melbourne model has been pretty steady, and I think it's showing no real signs of stopping, but who knows what the funding environment will bring. And I think that does create a bit of frustration on the parts of employers and on the parts of students as to what does their degree actually mean. And I think there's also a larger issue there of degree quality. So as you've got more students coming in, are they getting a quality experience? As you've got more students coming into postgraduate degrees, is the quality of those degrees being diluted as well? So I think there's a lot of interlinked issues here.
Great. Tech companies, I'm going to read the first question now. Now, my panellists, you have to read the questions too and nominate which one you'd like to answer. I'm going to go for the first, no, it's now the second one. Tech companies put less credence on degrees. Yes, that's true. And they have for many years. My experience would be because often university curricula can't keep up. That may or may not be true of other disciplines. They're often on the forefront of innovation, IT, tech companies. Don't you think other industries could go that way? Yes, I think they probably could. I'm not sure that medicine, engineering, dentistry, and a few of the other highly regulated professions will go that way or quickly, but yes, they could. Now, I'm going to share this around a bit, so is there one that you would like to take? Please, nominate and go. Because if you don't, I will.
You're next.
Great.
Look, maybe a high-level thought about the size and nature of the gap between employer expectations and what capabilities and attributes and knowledge and skills are generated out of the tertiary education system. On the one hand, we could argue that employers find it difficult to articulate their real skill needs, that they're short-term in their thinking, that they've got some perfect ideal of a work-ready graduate. Now, all of that is true, and yet the size of the gap between what employers tell us in New Zealand they are looking for and what they see from the capabilities generated by graduates is something that we need to, I think, take serious. And although on the one hand we've got a mainstream media bubbling over with trite comments about 21st century competencies and about the changing nature of work, about expectations of digital natives, I think it's too easy to be cynical about those things. We have to acknowledge that actually employers are looking for some of those soft skills, some of those transferable, transversal skills to a greater extent. We know that some professional associations and regulatory bodies are looking for greater input into the content and the nature of programs. We know that some programs seem to be surprisingly long, and it could be argued are more in the service of provider business imperatives than they are in service of the needs of graduate capabilities and end user requirements. So there are real issues around relevance and responsiveness, and I wouldn't argue that micro-credentials by any means are a panacea to that, but I do think variation in education products has the potential to help us think more innovatively, more creatively about how to be responsive, how to be flexible. And that must involve deep partnerships with end users, not simply consultation, but real engagement, co-design, co-creation, work-based learning where that's appropriate.
I'm going to pick up on soft skills and then I'm going to ask Gigi to have a look. There's two there with your name on it. Would you have a look on the screen? Great. So someone's asked us to comment on Alan Finkel's take on soft skills. The chief scientist often says, please teach people maths and don't get distracted with the soft skills. And I totally agree with him, and I sort of disagree with him as well. I would agree that everyone should have maths literacy. Why would you not want anyone to have that? To varying degrees. I don't think it's either or though. I think the so-called soft skills, and I know people in the room have heard me say this before, are in fact the hard skills to teach, the hard skills to evidence, and the hard skills to build on, because they are the people skills, the critical thinking, all of those other things we've heard about. I don't think it's an either-or situation. In fact, I think if you're a great mathematician, you'll be a very good logical thinker as well. So that's my take on that one. But Gigi, I'm going to throw to you now. Would you like to let people know what people are saying?
Yeah, I'm not going to pick a particular one. Well, there is one that says Gigi on it. So for Gigi and Gigi, okay. I want to pick up on the issue of soft skills and work-integrated learning and what you were saying about connections with industry. I think paradoxically, the best worker for the 21st century, the media doesn't want this to cut out, but the best worker is one who is adaptable, flexible, innovative, knows how to change and still be productive in order to meet the needs of a changing world. And that does not mean learning how to use current technology, for example. So PowerPoint, classes in schools, I have never liked that idea. Why would we do that? We're not going to be using PowerPoint in 20 years, probably, right? But you want to engage with some kind of material that you can look at from different angles and show children and university graduates as well, and in universities, how to adopt different paradigms to look at the same problem. So mental flexibility. And that is not something that is easily accessible, as you said, right? How do we know whether somebody's been taught to be mentally flexible? An employer knows. This is the power of markets. The power of market signals is they don't lie. Right? So no matter what stamps or badges or whatever is put onto something, if it fails the test in the market, it is not worthwhile from a social, economic standpoint in terms of putting into our educational program. So if we put in skills in learning how to use a particular software package, and that just isn't valued by employers, then the degree that teaches that will not be valuable, and the demand will fall for that, and it will disappear. That is the way market signals work. So I agree with you about getting signals from employers about what kinds of skills are useful, but I suspect that it's generally speaking going to be more like generalizable skills, transferable skills, and basic skills. English language competence is something that comes up again and again and again. We do not put enough emphasis on that in our universities. Even domestic students, and I'm not just talking about international students, English language skills are so important across the board. Trying to teach people skills remotely to external students is hard because you're not interacting in a classroom, you're not working together in a classroom, you know, trying to find your role in a group or something. That's hard to do, right? So there are basic barriers to these kinds of proliferated products, as you call them, in terms of how well we can teach a person these sorts of general skills and soft skills that are transferable across the board. So, you know, I do think work-integrated learning can be a useful thing, internships, providing a pathway to internships with industry, talking to industry about partnerships in that way. But I think the extent to which we really want to try to keep up with the frontier of technology while we're in the university sector, I mean, that's a fool's errand. We're not going to do that. So let's just stop trying to do that.
Great. Thank you, Gigi. There's a comment here. I didn't ask you what you were studying at the moment, Natasha, but there's a question. Is a broad-based liberal arts degree an answer to employers' expectations concerning graduate capabilities? Any comments? Are you happy to take that one?
Yeah, so I think it's the answer to a question, but not that question.
Okay.
So of course, if an employer can have someone who they don't have to pay as much because they're not as qualified, but will do more or less the same job, of course that is more desirable to them. However, I think we do need to bring like public good and individual good back into this conversation. I think a liberal arts degree is incredibly important for, let's say, going back to the journalism example. If someone, for example, has a history degree and then becomes a journalist, I think that would inform their journalism practice and allow them to make much more sophisticated analysis than someone that isn't qualified in that area and also has no interest in it, but maybe, you know, cheaper because they're younger, they're less qualified, and all of that. So yeah, I'd say employers probably, they seem to tell us that they don't really care about liberal arts degrees that much, and that makes sense. But we do have to really defend the value of these degrees and ensure that they are taught in a high quality way in our institutions.
I just might add, as an arts graduate myself, it's not career limiting really. It can be very good. Thank you. I just need to check if anyone would prefer to ask a question or make a comment, preferably a question, a short one from the audience. Please tell us and a microphone will come. I don't see any hands waving. There is a question on the screen, or is there one? No. There is a question on the screen that in order to do a postgraduate degree, you need to hold an undergraduate degree. And seeing we have a regulator from another country on the stage, Grant, would you like to respond to that? Do you need an undergraduate degree before you do a postgraduate degree? Comments?
So this is the way in which I postulated that micro-credentials could help us to think in a more creative way about how chunks of learning relate to a qualifications framework, because I don't think it's necessarily the case that it's not possible to do a piece of learning at level 9, for example, at master's level, unless you have completed an undergraduate degree first. That may be the entry requirement for a full master's program, but components of learning at different levels of complexity across the framework and different periods of duration reflected by the credit value can be mixed up. And so I'm not wanting to postulate that micro-credentials are a desirable replacement for full and formal qualifications. What I do want to argue, though, is that we may be underweighting the extent to which learners will increasingly have complex pathways and choice patterns for their study in the future. And that I'm not presaging the end of post-school, full-time, on-campus degrees where knowledge is front-loaded. I'm not saying that's coming to an end, but I am saying that increasingly learners are accessing their knowledge from a wide variety of sources. And so some of those traditional mechanisms for conveying knowledge in a kind of a set formula may be less and less relevant. And actually, I know that everybody in this room in different ways are leading activities and projects to ensure that tertiary education is increasingly flexible, responsive, and relevant, that access and equity grows. My only challenge would be, are we underweighting the extent to which learners leaving the compulsory system today may be looking for a greater variety of learning opportunities? Are we underweighting the extent to which employers and other end users are expecting a higher level of relevance and responsiveness? Is our system too provider-centric? And certainly in Australasia, it is more provider-driven in industry, in vet training, than in countries like Switzerland, Austria, Germany, for example.
So, I mean, I think it's true that there is this problem of an employer thinking, well, this graduate doesn't have the knowledge that's currently being used by, all the employees, our average employee. But typically employers will have training programs. And we spoke about this earlier, right? The typical thing that happens with a 22-year-old graduate from a university or other higher education provider is they'll get an entry-level job. They'll get an associate or whatever title, that sounds nice, but really means that you're kind of a dog's body. And you learn the way of that workplace, and you learn the software, you learn the tech, you learn the whatever. And what's important is your adaptability, your emotional intelligence, your ability to learn quickly and understand when you need to self-regulate to focus on something. These are all skills that are not part of the curriculum per se in universities, but they are required to get through the curriculum. Right? They're being able to study, knowing study skills, knowing how to communicate with a person. These are not things that we literally have on our assessment rubrics, but they are required in order to perform well on those rubrics. So the content is almost immaterial from that perspective. I mean, this is the radical extreme, is it doesn't matter what you learn as long as you learn how to learn it, and you learn how to interact about it with other people, and how to read them and be able to, somehow combine whatever the skills are that you have about that thing. Whatever employer you end up at will train you in the specifics. You need the general program. Right? So I just think that's a more viable long-term solution for the higher education sector to aim for.
One of the things to add to that is that students don't just acquire an education when they go to an education provider. They also acquire a network.
Oh, yes.
And so in the gig economy, a network is in fact in many ways more important to you than an education.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. Did everyone hear me? No.
A
Can you
network
turn my mic
is...
on, please? Did I turn it off? No, it's on
Just
now.
use the lectern.
So the point I was trying to make, I'll just use this one. The point I was trying to make is that not everyone acquires simply an education when they attend a higher education provision institution. They actually acquire a network. And in the gig economy, a network is sometimes more important or just as important as the education that they've acquired. It's almost time to wrap up.
Thought so.
Throw any last questions?
Well, maybe we can have any last comment, can we? Just a really quick elevator pitch. Gigi, your main message.
Main message is that universities should look after the quality in their own programs before starting to think about extending to MOOCs and externals and micro-credentials and whatnot. I think there's a huge advantage to being a bricks and mortar institution. There are many types of skills that get taught particularly well when people are together, and we should focus on that core competency.
Yep, just building on some of Gigi's comments, I think there's still extreme value in a standard 3-year generalist degree, and I think sometimes we forget that when we see that there are other options there. We may need to consider that different things are different for different people, are appropriate for different people, and that there are equity considerations as well. And we shouldn't forget that some students will be doing these shorter, easier to get into courses or cheaper courses because they simply do not have the time or support in order to do the degree and get that experience, which they may actually want.
I think regardless of modality or form of institution that's providing education, the real issues remain access and equity and quality and relevance. I don't think we've cracked those, and it follows that more variation, better and deeper relationships with external partners and parties are critical. And I think that variation includes a wider range of education products, both for themselves and for what they might do to encourage more innovation and responsiveness over time.
And I will say that the digital economy is upon us. I don't think the bricks and mortar are going to go away anytime soon, but if the digital channel enables more people to get a brilliant education and let them take their next step in life, let's go explore it without compromising quality.
I'd like to thank this panel for another reason, which is that you introduced right at the conclusion there the relevance in the room. The relevance are, the theme of today's talk, or all talks. So it's a bad pun, you might not have been here for the keynote this morning, which was about elephants and relevance. Thank you so much for a really engaging pre-lunch talk, which was the dinner talk that takes us to lunch.